In 1985, a group of officers approach Farmer Patrick to tell him about a tragedy in the family. Patrick's brother, sister-in-law, and younger niece are all dead. The only survivor is his older niece Jane, who was found in a corner of the house covered in blood with a shaver in her hands. 25 years later, Jane is a photographer specializing in abandoned houses. After the tragedy, she was adopted by a foster home, but she also got no memory of her childhood, her family, or what happened that awful day. She's now married to Alan and together they have a daughter called Alice, although Jane's relationship with them is quite strained because she has memory lapses that make her forget things like meetings or picking Alice up from school. One afternoon, while looking for new houses to photograph with Alice, Jane comes across her childhood home. She doesn't recognize it, but she's still incredibly fascinated by it and takes a bunch of pictures. While her mom works, Alice finds a jack on the ground and chats with its mysterious owner, who cannot be seen. Later at home, Jane calls the county chiefs and asks for the property records for this farmhouse. It's late in the evening when someone rings the bell and Jane finds they've left a box at the door. Inside there's the jack Alice had found and a bug that takes Jane aback. A few days later, Jane continues to be obsessed with the latest farmhouse she's seen and can't stop staring at the picture she took after printing it. This causes her to forget about picking up Alice at school until Alan calls her to remind her, prompting Jane to take the road in a hurry. While driving, she gets a call from a young girl's voice that she thinks is Alice, telling Jane she wants you to come back. At that moment, a blonde girl appears in the middle of the street, and as Jane falls into another memory lapse, she accidentally crashes her car. The last thing she hears before passing out is she wants you to come back again. Sometime later, Jane wakes up in the hospital but can't remember who Alan and Alice are. The doctor takes Alan to his office to explain the issue. The accident has aggravated a severe older injury that has made her amnesia worse. Meanwhile, Jane is approached by Liam, a psychiatrist that will help her work on her memory issues with various exercises. She can get her memory back, but it'll take time. Some hours later, Jane hears a noise outside her room and follows it to find Susie, the blonde girl she saw on the road. She tries to get in contact with the girl, but Susie runs and hides, and before Jane can do anything she's interrupted by Alan and Alice, who are leaving for the evening. At least this time, Jane is starting to recognize their faces. After some tests with Liam, Jane goes to bed and looks through a bunch of family pictures to try to help her memory. A knock on the door makes her get up only to find a box like the one she had found at home. This time she finds a little ballerina inside together with a picture of the farmhouse. On the other side of the photograph, someone wrote down the date of the tragedy, sending Jane into a breakdown. Meanwhile at home, Alan also hears the bell ring and finds an envelope with some important paperwork outside. The next day, Alan brings those papers to Jane with some big news. The farmhouse belongs to her, and her uncle Patrick has been taking care of it all this time. Jane doesn't even remember requesting this paperwork or having an uncle, but she sees this as an opportunity, and Liam agrees that a visit may help her push out those old memories. Determined to learn more about her past, Jane calls Patrick, who is shocked to hear from Jane but promises to welcome her anytime she wants to come by. A few days later, the whole family goes to visit Patrick, and Jane makes sure to ignore the visions she has of Susie appearing on the road. Patrick apologizes to Jane for having sent her to foster care, but he wouldn't have made a good father and he wanted her to have a good life. After he gives her the key to the farmhouse, Jane asks what happened to her family, and Patrick explains they died inside the house without adding any details. While Jane is thankful for his help, she still can't remember him. Afterward, the family goes to the farmhouse, which makes Jane extremely nervous. She leaves the building through the back door to catch some air only to hear a weird noise, and when she follows it to the middle of the field, she finds a red balloon holding a key and a little note welcoming her home. Meanwhile, Alan and Alice explore the house and finds Jane's childhood room. There's another room belonging to Jane's sister and Alan has to find the hidden key to unlock it. Inside they find an old music box that Alice can't open and a few other toys. On their way out, Alan forgets the key inside and the door gets locked again on its own. The following day, the family goes to explore the nearest town. Jane visits an antique store, where clerk Jennifer subtly guides her to a framed newspaper page from 1985 containing an article about the tragedy that implies Jane could have been responsible. At that moment, Jane gets a call from Liam because they were supposed to have an appointment today. Liam's proud to hear she's working on her memories, but he also swears he's at his office, which contradicts the fact Jane can now see him in the store. After they hang up, Jane follows Liam out of the building and into the hay bale maze, where she gets lost and begins getting desperate with anxiety. In the end, she gives up and leaves the maze by breaking one of its walls. Then Jane rushes back to her car, where she finds another little box waiting for her. At first she tries to ignore it, but curiosity gets the better of her and makes her open it anyway. Inside the box, Jane finds half a picture where she can see her younger self, her mother with a blurry face, and Susie, who turns out to be her sister. Later at home, Jane's sleeping is interrupted by Alice, who asks her to be quiet because they'll hear her. Confused, Jane follows Alice to Susie's room, where she sees a memory of her mother giving her sister the music box. Suddenly, her daughter says Alice isn't really there now, and the ghosts of her mother and Susie turn towards Jane, who notices Susie has a tool in her hands. Scared, Jane runs away to her old room, where she sees her younger self and finds a shaver in her hands appearing out of nowhere. Desperate and afraid, Jane returns to the main room to try to wake Alan up, but he stays asleep while Susie crawls out from the under the bed, saying Jane has come to find them. Jane runs to hide in the closet, but Susie finds her there too. After lots of struggling, Susie ends up on the floor with Jane's hands on her, and the moment Jane blinks, she finds herself in Alice's room with her hands around her daughter. Thankfully, Alice wakes up and shakes her mother out of her mind lapse before sending her back to her own room, where Jane doesn't see Susie anymore but does find a jack on the floor. The next day, Jane goes to see Patrick to demand answers. Patrick explains his brother had been a drunk with a bit of a temper, but he worked hard and never hurt his family, and unfortunately, the only person that knows what happened the day of the tragedy is Jane herself. Later during breakfast, Alice notices Jane is tired and says she's sorry Susie kept her up last night, but before Jane can ask her what she means, Alan comes over and Jane asks him to take Alice to the lake. She thinks the house is making her feel worse, so she wants to go home after Alice gets her wish. Once Alan and Alice are gone, Jane goes to Susie's room, opening it with the key that came with the balloon. After looking around for a while, she sees Susie through the window entering the old barn and decides to follow her. In the old barn, Jane finds their old sheet fort, which has a box with various objects including Susie's asthma medicine, a Swiss knife, and a little key Jane takes with her. Suddenly, Susie appears to tell Jane she shouldn't be there, she should be hiding because the monster is coming. Then, Susie guides Jane inside the fort and tells her to run. Jane does so until she moves the sheets aside and finds herself in the middle of the field. On the ground, there's an open box with an old shaver. Meanwhile, Alice tells Alan of some weird dreams she's had. An old lady told her Jane may hurt her, but Alice doesn't believe it because she knows the real danger is the monster in the bedroom. A few hours later, the family begins packing their things, unaware that Liam is watching from afar. Jane can't stop looking at the old picture only to be interrupted when she hears Alice running toward the old barn. When she follows her there, Jane finds out it's actually Susie, who tells her they can't let her leave. Suddenly, the real Alice appears behind her, and Jane's so anxious and scared that she unconsciously puts her hands around Alice. Fortunately, Alan shows up before she can do anything stupid, and while Alice runs back to the house, Alan begins yelling at Jane for hurting their daughter as they follow her out. To their surprise, they find the Swiss knife from the barn stuck in one of the car wheels, which is now flat. Jane swears she didn't do it, and their argument is interrupted when Alice suddenly begins yelling inside the house, asking for help. When her parents reach her, she explains she had been chased by a man that she calls the monster under the bed, then she begins to have an asthma attack. This is the first time it happens, but Jane recognizes it because Susie used to go through the same. Alan picks Alice up and rushes downstairs, only to find the front door locked. Jane remembers Susie's words and steps back, which instantly opens the door because the ghosts only want her to stay. While Alan asks a passing car for help to take Alice to the hospital, Jane explores the house looking for answers, and finds a little piece of paper saying tag, "You are it." As soon as Jane accepts to play, Susie shows up and guides her to her room, where Jane opens the music box with the little key from the barn. Inside she finds two ballerinas like the one she got in the box and the other half of the picture, which reveals Liam is Jane's dad. Before she can process the meaning of this, Susie makes Jane hide with her under the bed because the monster is coming, and at that moment, Patrick enters the room, bringing gifts for Susie inside those same small boxes. Jane runs out of the bedroom, afraid of what comes next, but Liam shows up and makes her stay so she can finally understand. It turns out Patrick is the monster. Whenever he babysat the girls, he would come to Susie's bedroom and take advantage of her. The night of the tragedy, young Jane had been hiding under Susie's bed and had to see it all. Their parents came home earlier than expected, and Liam immediately fell asleep on the couch. Their mother, who turned out to be Jennifer, heard Susie's attempts at asking for help and went upstairs with a tool in hand. As soon as Patrick saw her, he fought her for the tool and ended up killing her, dropping her on the floor for Jane to see. The awful situation triggered one of Susie's asthma attacks, but instead of helping her, Patrick went after young Jane, who had enough and was trying to escape. While the noises finally woke Liam up, young Jane hid in the bathroom and grabbed the shaver, so when Patrick came closer, she hurt him with it before running away again. On her way downstairs, Jane bumped into Liam, causing them both to fall and hit the floor. The violent landing instantly killed Liam and hurt Jane's head, explaining the amnesia. After seeing his brother dead, Patrick went to check on Susie, but it was too late for her as well. The asthma attack killed her. To avoid getting in trouble, Patrick grabbed the tool and put it in Liam's hand before leaving. Shortly after, Jane woke up and the shock of seeing her dead father made her so scared that she ran to hide in the corner, where the cops found her later. Back in the present, Liam explains he didn't tell Jane these things directly because he needed her to be here to set the ghost free. In tears, Jane apologizes to her family, who disappear when Alan finally comes back. He explains Alice is better and he left her with Patrick, which makes Jane worry for the safety of her daughter and force the car to move with a flat tire. Meanwhile, Patrick is starting to talk inappropriately to Alice, making her promise she won't tell anyone about the game he'll show her and accidentally calling her Susie. When he hears Alan and Jane arrive, he grabs a firearm and takes Alice to the barn, shooting when Alan tries to come closer. Since Patrick's eyes are on Alan, Jane gets to approach him from behind without him noticing, and she knocks him out with a shovel. Moments later, Patrick wakes up in Susie's room with his hands tied, and Jane leaves him there with the door locked so the ghosts can finally have their revenge. Now that her memories are back, Jane has no issues with visiting her family's grave, where she leaves the old picture to close this chapter of her past and start a better life with Alan and Alice. Meanwhile, in the old farmhouse, nobody can hear Patrick's screams asking for help. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can watch more videos like this. Thanks for watching.